I used to believe I could survive anywhere. That with enough grit, enough heart, I could make it through any time or place history might throw at me. But then, I studied feudal Japan, and I realized I wouldn't last a single morning. Not because I'm soft, not because I'm lazy, but because feudal Japan wasn't just a place. It was a performance. An intricate theater where every man, woman, and child was assigned a role at birth, and punished, sometimes fatally, for forgetting their lines. Before we go any deeper, take a breath. Get comfortable. Dim your lights. Maybe let that low hum of a fan soothe you. And if you enjoy sinking into these quiet explorations through time, if you like peeling back the fabric of civilization and seeing what's underneath, then consider liking this video. Subscribe if the mood feels right. I don't ask lightly, only if you truly enjoy the journey. Now, let me take you there. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock or morning sun, but to obligation, not dreams. In feudal Japan, you don't get to decide who you are. That decision was made long before you were even born by ancestors you've never met, by a bloodline you can't escape. I remember once, as a kid, asking my grandfather if he believed in fate. He stared out across the field behind his house, quiet for a long time. Some people carry a destiny like a flame, he finally said. Others are just carrying their family's ashes. That line has haunted me ever since, because that's what life was like in feudal Japan. If you were born to a samurai family, congratulations, your life would be bound to a blade. Not just carrying it, but sleeping beside it, training with it, living in fear of disgracing it. The sword wasn't just a weapon, it was your soul. I sometimes wonder, could I have been a samurai? Could I have walked with that kind of discipline? Could I have stared death in the face with the same serenity required to spill my own blood in a ritual called seppuku? I doubt it. Because a samurai's life wasn't about courage. It was about never making a single mistake. Ever. Speak too loudly, bow too shallowly, wrinkle your robe. And your life, or worse, your family's honor, could be shattered. But if you weren't born to the sword, things didn't get easier. Let's say you were born a peasant. That meant mud under your nails, in your lungs, soaking into your bones. Your days started before the sun and ended long after it vanished behind the rice paddies. And if you didn't deliver enough rice to your lord, if a bandit rode through your fields or your harvest came up short, well, that wasn't an inconvenience. That was a death sentence. I once spent a summer helping on a rice farm, just a weekend trip, volunteering, city boy curiosity, 2 days in the heat, bent over, boots sinking into muck. I still remember the dull ache in my back, the sting of sunburn across my shoulders. I remember thinking, people lived like this every single day, for generations. And they didn't complain, not because they didn't want to, but because complaining was dangerous. In feudal Japan, your voice was a liability. Your opinion could get you killed. It wasn't just about class, it was about silence. If you were a woman, your silence was expected not just in the house, but in your heart. You married who you were told to marry. You smiled when you were supposed to smile. And if you were lucky you might be allowed to write poetry, not for self-expression, but to display grace. Feudal Japan was elegant, yes. Cherry blossoms, tea ceremonies, poetry that could split a soul in half. But beneath that beauty was a quiet brutality. A system so precise, so crushing, it didn't need to scream. It whispered. It folded you neatly into submission. And that was before breakfast. Breakfast, if you were a peasant, was survival. A bowl of rice porridge, maybe, or just the memory of one. I remember my grandmother, during hard times, boiling barley and pretending it was rice. She'd hum softly while stirring it, never letting on that it wasn't what we wanted it to be. That kind of quiet endurance, that was the spirit of feudal Japan. And hygiene? Oh, they were clean, but not because it felt good, because cleanliness was sacred, spiritual. If your lord inspected you and found dirt beneath your nails, that was dishonor. If your robe was wrinkled, if your hair was out of place, that wasn't laziness. That was a moral failing. I can't tell you how many times I've faked a smile during a meeting because my shirt had a wrinkle. But imagine if that wrinkle wasn't embarrassing. Imagine if it was treasonous. Bathing wasn't relaxing. It was ritual. Cold water, harsh soap made from ash. Communal bathhouses where privacy was a myth, and shame was the currency of the room. You bathed in silence, next to your landlord, your in-laws, your rivals. And if you dirtied the water, social suicide. Everything in feudal Japan was about performance, even death. Samurai were trained not only to kill, but to die properly. If you disgraced your lord, your family, or even your own shadow, you were expected to kneel, draw a blade, and cut, not out of despair, out of duty. Can you imagine that kind of control, that kind of internalized discipline? To meet your end not with rage, but with ceremony. I once asked myself, late at night, if I could do it. If someone handed me a knife and told me it was the only way to save my family's name. I stared at the ceiling and knew the answer. No, I couldn't. But in feudal Japan, you didn't get to say no. There was no no. There was only obedience, discipline, and silence. Ohs. Even laughter was dangerous. Laugh at the wrong moment, and you might insult someone above your station. And in a world where rank mattered more than reason, that could end in exile, or worse. Once, during a visit to Kyoto, I attended a traditional tea ceremony. I thought I knew what to expect. I didn't. Every motion from how to sit, to how to bow, to how to lift the cup was coded, choreographed. The host didn't smile. She moved like the surface of a lake. I reached for my cup with the wrong hand, and the room went still. Not angry, just still. That silence was louder than any scolding, because in feudal Japan, even your mistakes were supposed to be beautiful. And if they weren't, well, neither were you. Let me tell you something strange. There's a part of me, maybe the same part that stays up at night staring into dark corners. There's a part of me that envies that precision, that absolute certainty, to live a life where everything is decided, every bow measured, every syllable weighed. It's terrifying, but it's also simple. You know your place, you know your purpose. But make no mistake, it was a gilded cage. Even clothing wasn't self-expression, it was declaration. What you wore didn't tell people who you were. It told them who you were allowed to be. Colors, fabric, sleeve length. It all screamed your rank before you opened your mouth. I once bought a vintage kimono from an antique shop. I thought it was beautiful, deep navy, embroidered cranes, silk like moonlight. The shop owner smiled kindly and told me that kimono was only ever worn by men of a certain rank. If you wore that, she said, a few centuries ago, you'd be killed for pretending. So, pretending. Pretending to be more than what you were born to be was a crime in feudal Japan. Even merchants, people with money, were considered lowly, because their wealth didn't come from labor, it came from cleverness. And cleverness, well, cleverness was suspicious. I used to think ambition was noble, that working hard to improve your life was admirable, but in feudal Japan, ambition was treason. Climbing the ladder wasn't possible. You bowed to the ladder and stayed at the bottom, quiet, grateful. And if you were one of the Eta, the untouchables, your work might be essential, but your presence was unwelcome. Butchers, tanners, executioners, they kept the system running, but were treated like shadows, needed but unseen, like ghosts that smell of blood. Imagine living your life like that, contributing to society and still being treated like a stain. Even within the classes, the pressure was suffocating. A samurai might hold a sword, but he also held an invisible noose. One wrong word, one mistake in posture, one lapse in etiquette, and suddenly your honor is questioned. And in a society where honor is everything, that's like questioning your right to breathe. Women? Their worlds were even smaller. Their freedom ended where their father's opinion began. Marriage was an arrangement, not a choice. Love was a luxury for poets and fools. And if you were lucky enough to be educated, it wasn't to express yourself. It was to serve better, speak softly, pour tea without a ripple. I used to think a quiet life meant peace, but not like this, not like this. Even meals carried the weight of expectation. For peasants, food was function. Rice, pickled radish, maybe a dried fish that could double as a weapon if swung correctly. For the upper class, slightly better, but always eaten after their lords. The concept of eating while your master was still chewing, unthinkable. I once fasted for 48 hours for spiritual reasons. On the second night, I walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and just looked. Not for food, for comfort. That hollow ache in my belly. In feudal Japan, that would have just been Tuesday. Food wasn't flavor. It was survival. Everything seasonal. Not because it was trendy, because there was no other option. No refrigeration. No imports. If the land didn't provide, you went without. And if you dared to steal food, not a slap on the wrist, a public example, public shame, or worse. Well, now imagine you're born a child in a samurai household. You're not learning how to ride a bike or draw spaceships. You're learning posture, poetry, and swordsmanship. You're being taught how to die with dignity before you've even learned how to laugh freely. Discipline was injected into your soul like ink into a scroll. Well, you trained every day, not just to fight, but to exist correctly. You learned calligraphy, archery, strategy, and you carried yourself with a stillness so intense it looked like a man mid-funeral. That expressionless face, it wasn't rudeness, it was training. Showing too much emotion was shameful. You were expected to be stone. Laugh too loud, and you were seen as crude. Cry, and you were weak. Anger was for animals. Fear, for the dead. That's the world they lived in. And I wonder, how many of us today could manage even a week of that? We post our thoughts. We wear what we want. We fall in and out of love freely. But there, a single misstep could become a legacy your children would pay for. Yes, your children. In feudal Japan, you didn't just represent yourself. You represented your family, your clan, your ancestors. The actions you took could bring shame that echoed for generations, and that wasn't poetic exaggeration. That was law. That was life. I remember once offending an uncle at a family gathering. I made a joke, something innocent, or so I thought. The silence that followed taught me more about social weight than any lecture ever could. I imagine in feudal Japan, I wouldn't have gotten a chance to apologize. Because apologies, they weren't just, I'm sorry. In a sense of, they were ritual. No, you bowed, deeply, sincerely. You might send gifts, write poems of shame, and you had to mean it. A wrong tone could be mistaken for sarcasm, and then, well, you might as well sharpen your own blade. In this world, silence wasn't empty. It was a shield, a tool, a strategy. People didn't speak freely because speech had consequences. Even inside your own home, hierarchy ruled. Sons obeyed fathers, wives obeyed husbands, daughters obeyed everyone. To interrupt was dangerous. To disagree, fatal. There were no free thinkers, not unless they wanted to be free of their heads. So when I hear people talk about the simplicity of the past, the elegance of feudal Japan, I nod, but I don't agree. Because that beauty, it came at a cost, a terrifying cost. Let's keep going. You want to know what fashion looked like? It wasn't about trends. It was about control. Your clothes told the world what you were allowed to be. The cut, the color, the length of a sleeve, all signals. Samurai wore layered silk robes, every fold, every thread, precise. Colors were deep, navy, blood red, earthen brown, each one sending a silent message. I've killed a man for less than a fashion mistake. Their swords? The daisho? A matched pair of blades, not just weapons, symbols of status. If you wore them wrong, it wasn't a faux pas. It was a fatal error. Peasants? Cotton. Always cotton, always brown or beige or some shade of dirt. Not for style, but because dye cost money, and you didn't have any. Merchants had money, but money didn't buy respect, so they dressed quietly. Just rich enough to survive, not rich enough to attract a bored samurai. Even women's fashion was coded like a secret language. Hairstyles had meaning, kimono patterns were seasonal, wear the wrong print at the wrong time, and you'd dishonor your entire household. So when I see people in the West romanticize that era, when they say, I wish I lived back then, I shake my head. Because they're picturing moonlight walks, cherry blossoms falling gently in the breeze, a samurai whispering poetry under a lantern glow. But love was a fantasy. In feudal Japan, love wasn't a right. It wasn't a storybook ending. It was an inconvenience. You didn't marry for affection. You married for alliances, for land, for tax breaks. Your parents picked your partner, often before you'd even hit puberty. If you were a peasant, your match was made for practicality. Strong arms, working teeth, and enough rice to survive the winter. That was romance. If you were a samurai, it was worse. Your spouse was a political maneuver. A pawn moved across the board to secure your clan's future. Maybe they had soft eyes. Maybe they didn't. It didn't matter. You weren't supposed to love them. You were supposed to honor them. And that's a very different thing. I've had heartbreak. We all have. The kind where your chest feels hollow and the world tilts sideways. But at least it was mine. At least it was a choice. In feudal Japan, there was no heartbreak, only duty. And if you did fall in love, a flute teacher, a temple guard, a merchant's daughter, that love could get you killed. Adultery wasn't a scandal. It was a crime. The punishment wasn't whispered gossip. It was exile, disgrace, or death. Sometimes all three. And if your husband was dishonored, you might be expected to follow him into death. Not metaphorically, literally. I read once about a samurai widow who took her own life with the same blade her husband used, not out of grief, out of expectation. Because in this world, grief wasn't personal, it was ceremonial. And death was never far. In modern life, we pretend we're immortal. We eat kale, do yoga, download meditation apps. In feudal Japan, death was a roommate, always present, always listening. Wanswa. If you were a samurai, you were trained to die well. If you failed your lord, seppuku. If you embarrassed your ancestors, seppuku. If you tripped on your words during a speech, you'd better start composing your death poem. And yes, there were poems. You didn't just die. You had to articulate your final moment with grace. A few lines of verse before the final act. That's how seriously they took their exit. I tried once to write a death poem, just for reflection. It felt fake, forced, because I didn't believe I was about to die. But they did, every day. And they prepared for it with the same care we might prepare for a wedding. Hint. But peasants weren't spared either. If your harvest failed, your family starved. If a bandit rode through your village and the taxes were late, your head could roll before the sun hit noon. And let's not forget, disease was rampant, childbirth was dangerous, and earthquakes were regular guests. Kill. Japan was beautiful, breathtaking mountains, sacred shrines, rolling forests. But that same land could turn on you in an instant. Typhoons, tsunamis, floods, one storm and your life's work washed away like ink in the rain. And yet, people kept going. They woke up. They cleaned themselves in freezing water. They bowed to people they despised. They served tea while grieving. They stitched kimono while starving. They built shrines while burying children. Why? Because that's what was expected. Because in feudal Japan, the individual didn't matter. The clan did. You weren't you. You were your father's son, your grandmother's legacy, your great-uncle's honor reborn, and every mistake you made was a stone thrown at a house built by generations. I remember once a teacher told me, "You are your ancestors' prayers answered." It stuck with me. In feudal Japan, that line would have been law. Want to start a noodle shop because you like to cook? Not allowed. Your family raises horses. You raise horses. Want to become a painter? Fine. You'll decorate the temple your family sponsors. Quietly, modestly. No flair, no personal touches. Because art wasn't self-expression. It was proof of discipline. Even poetry, perhaps the most romanticized part of Japanese culture, was a minefield. Write the wrong seasonal metaphor, use a flower out of context, and you'd be dismissed as uncultured. Hisabi Yizao. A single misplaced brushstroke could reflect inner chaos. You'd be labeled spiritually flawed. That's not art. That's war. Even folding a kimono was a test. Even how you poured tea could reveal weakness. Even the way you watched the moon too soft. And you were naive, too cold, and you were unfeeling. I don't know about you, but I would have failed every test. Because feudal Japan wasn't just hard, it was exhausting. It required constant performance, constant silence, constant sacrifice. And still, I admire it. Not because it was fair, not because it was kind, but because it endured. Through floods, through invasions, through famine and fire, this society held its shape. It bowed, but didn't break. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not that we couldn't survive there, but but that so many did. Oh, quietly, faithfully, elegantly. They followed the script even when it killed them. They bowed before death with poetry on their lips. They loved in silence, served in shadows, and lived in a world so beautiful it sometimes looked like heaven, and so unforgiving it often felt like hell. So, if you think you'd last a day in feudal Japan, I ask you this. Could you hold your tongue when someone wronged you? Could you fold your soul into silence for the sake of your father's name? Could you kneel before your lord and whisper an apology, even when you didn't believe you'd done anything wrong? Could you die well? I couldn't. But they did. And they didn't just die well, they died on cue. When the curtain of shame fell, they didn't storm off stage. They delivered their final line, unsheathed their short blade, and met the silence with blood and grace. That's not discipline. That's devotion. That's erasure of the self, so complete that even your final breath isn't yours. It belongs to your name. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to belong entirely to a system, not in part, not with conditions, fully. Feudal Japan didn't allow you to belong to yourself. You were born into a family, and that family was your mirror. Your reputation wasn't yours. It was a collective inheritance, guarded like a shrine, feared like a storm. Every smile had weight. Every word had consequence. Sometimes I wonder, would that kind of life give me clarity? In our modern world of infinite choices, so many of us are paralyzed by possibility. Who to be, what to do, where to go. But in feudal Japan, none of those questions existed. You were what you were born to be. And maybe that simplicity, terrible as it was, held a kind of dark serenity. But serenity didn't mean safety, not when nature itself seemed to resent your breath. Feudal Japan was not a kind host. Typhoons swept in like angry gods. Earthquakes struck with no warning, as if the land itself grew impatient. I've seen footage of Japanese earthquakes in the modern era. The ground shudders like a living thing. The buildings tremble. Now imagine that in a wooden hut. No steel, no warning systems. Just a deep rumble and a prayer you didn't finish in time. And then the floods, rivers that swelled overnight, crops drowned, livestock vanished, and still your taxes were due. Your lord didn't want your excuses. He wanted his rice. I remember hiking once, deep in a forest. It started to rain, light at first, then heavy. I tried to find shelter. My shoes slipped in the mud, my phone had no signal, and for a brief moment I understood helplessness. Now imagine that, not for an afternoon, but for a lifetime. No boots, no emergency number, just you, the land, and its moods. Winter was another adversary. It didn't just chill your skin, it seeped into your bones. Fires died early, blankets were thin, and waking up meant bargaining with the cold every single morning. There's something humbling about the idea that survival depended not just on strength, but on submission, to seasons, to storms, to systems. And in this backdrop of endless trials, the hierarchy ruled like scripture. No matter who you were, someone was always above you, and someone was always waiting to see you stumble. Power flowed downward like water through a crack, and the weight of expectation crushed everyone equally. Peasants answered to headmen, headmen to samurai, samurai to daimyo, daimyo to the shogun. The shogun, in theory, bowed to the emperor, but the emperor ruled nothing. He was a divine puppet, clothed in silk and silence. Even the shogun, the most powerful man in the land, didn't sleep peacefully. He had rivals, cousins, paranoia as a pillow. He watched the clans. They watched him. Every letter intercepted, every alliance inspected. Power in feudal Japan came not from title, but from surviving the chessboard. And if you thought you could rise, that ambition would lift you, you were wrong. Ambition was a red flag. To want more than your role allowed wasn't seen as inspiration. It was seen as infection. Dangerous, contagious, possibly deadly. I used to think history was full of underdogs who rose above their station, but in feudal Japan, the underdog didn't bark. It bowed, it submitted, and if it howled, it was silenced. Even education followed this rigid path. So, chat, if you were born a samurai, you were taught to read, write, kill, and compose. Poetry, warfare, posture. A boy would learn how to write his death poem before he learned to kiss. A girl would learn how to pour tea before she learned to dream. Merchant families? They learned enough to do business, math, ledgers, bartering. You weren't educated to explore the world. You were educated to navigate it quietly. Peasants didn't go to school. They learned how to survive, which grain to plant, how to dig a well, how to bow when the tax collector came, and how to nod while he counted your rice and your ribs. And girls? Unless you were from the highest ranks, you learned silence, needlework, serving, moving without disturbing air. That wasn't oppression as we know it. That was life. Culture in feudal Japan wasn't leisure. It was law. Flower arranging, tea ceremonies, calligraphy. These weren't hobbies. They were tests. Each brushstroke a judgment. Each fold in a kimono a verdict. If you moved wrong, if you bowed wrong, if you laughed wrong, your spirit was considered flawed. And if your spirit was flawed, well, that explained everything, didn't it? I once folded an origami crane, then watched someone do the same in Kyoto. Their version didn't look like paper. It looked like prayer. That's the difference. I was doing it for fun. They were performing a ritual of precision, handed down for centuries. Even a cup of tea had rules. Sit, bow, rotate the cup twice, express humble gratitude, drink in silence. Every moment was a minefield. It wasn't about enjoying the tea. It was about showing you were worthy of it. This wasn't art. This was surveillance dressed as tradition. And in that world you weren't free. You were on display. Always. Well, so no, you wouldn't last a day, and neither would I. Not because we're weak, but because we're free. Too free. We ask questions. We laugh too loudly. We wear shoes indoors. We dream out of turn. And in feudal Japan, that would have been the first mistake. And the last. But I haven't even told you about the illusion of choice yet. Because maybe, just maybe, you're thinking, all right, I wouldn't be a samurai. I wouldn't be a peasant. I'd be an artist, a poet, a monk maybe. That sounds peaceful, right? Let me ruin that for you. In feudal Japan, even the so-called peaceful lives were soaked in pressure. Artists weren't free to create. They were expected to follow the old forms, the rules of composition, the hierarchy of brushstrokes. Create something new, and you weren't seen as a genius. You were seen as arrogant. And arrogance, like everything else in that world, had a price. I once stood in front of a calligraphy scroll in a Kyoto museum. Just ink on rice paper. That's all it was. But the way the lines curved, soft, intentional, holding back like breath before a bow, it made me understand something. That scroll wasn't about writing. It was about restraint. In feudal Japan, beauty wasn't expression. It was control. And monks, don't get romantic. A life of prayer and peace, sure, but also a life of austerity so extreme it made suffering a daily practice. Waking before the sun, chanting until your throat went raw, fasting, not for clarity, but because hunger was holy. They weren't seeking comfort. They were erasing desire. And you soft, caffeinated, screen-glowing you wouldn't last one morning in that monastery. Let's not pretend. Now, let's talk about governance, the people who ran this world. You'd think the daimyo, the lords, had it easy, but the higher you climbed, the sharper the swords that pointed at your back. A daimyo had land, yes. Power, yes. But freedom? No. Because the moment he looked too comfortable, too wealthy, too independent, the shogun would notice. And when the shogun noticed, bad things happened. Inspections, interrogations, assassinations, sometimes dressed in ceremony. Even the shogun, the top of the mountain, was surrounded by shadows. He ruled with paranoia. Every cousin a threat, every gift a test, every poem read aloud a potential coded insult. And the emperor? He was a ghost in silk, revered but irrelevant. Worshipped but powerless. A symbol, not a man. And if he dared to speak outside his script, the world would remind him what he was divine, yes, but only on paper. So where in all of that do you belong? Where could you breathe? The truth is nowhere. Feudal Japan was a society engineered to survive storms, War, famine, and time itself. But not freedom. Never freedom. And here's the tragic part. They knew. Deep down, I think every peasant knew they would die as they were born. Every woman knew her voice would be trained out of her. Every samurai knew that death, when it came, would not be a surprise, but an appointment. But they kept going, not with rebellion, not with hope, with grace. Because in that world, dignity wasn't about being seen. It was about disappearing correctly. I think of that when I see an old photo, a black and white image of a farmer's wife, hair bound tightly, hands stained with earth. She isn't smiling. She isn't frowning. She simply is. That kind of presence, it's heavy, it's holy. And I wonder, have we forgotten that? We spend so much time proving who we are, posting, sharing, shouting into the digital void. In feudal Japan, the most honorable thing you could do was to not exist loudly. There's something beautiful about that, and terrifying. But we haven't talked about the final act, the end, the closing of the curtain. Because in feudal Japan, even death was choreographed. A real hero didn't run from the blade. He knelt before it, composed a haiku, made peace with his ancestors, and then bled into the tatami with silence. Not fear, not fury, just stillness. Can you imagine dying like that? No hospital room, no family at your bedside, just a short blade and the expectation that you'd die properly. I once tried to write what I thought would be a fitting death poem. I couldn't. Everything sounded too selfish, too modern, too me. Because that's the thing we've been taught to center ourselves in every story. In feudal Japan, the story wasn't yours to tell. You were a sentence in a book written generations ago. And your job was to make sure the next page was worth turning. Now, let's pretend, just for a moment, that you survived it. You didn't speak out of turn. You didn't shame your father. You didn't starve. You served. You worked. You prayed. You raised your children to do the same. Congratulations! You now face a new opponent, nature. Feudal Japan was beautiful cherry blossoms falling like snow, mist curling around temples, koi swimming in perfect circle. But that same beauty hit a land of violence. Typhoons could wipe away your rice fields in an afternoon. Earthquakes split villages before you had time to run. Floods drowned whole families. Droughts cracked the earth like glass. And your lord still wanted taxes. There was no insurance, no relief fund, just the weight of expectation, no matter how high the water rose. So you rebuilt. And if you couldn't rebuild, you bowed to the end. Because feudal Japan didn't give you room for tragedy, only decorum. Even the temples built in that era, those stunning wooden structures, they were constructed to bend, not break, to move with the wind, to yield. That's the philosophy of the time. You resist, and you snap. Bend, and you survive. So, when people say, I wish I could have lived back then, I ask them which version. Oh, the poetic one, or the real one? Do you want to wear the kimono, but not the silence? Hold the sword, but not the burden? Sip the tea, but not earn the cup? And I was. Because the real feudal Japan didn't care about your preferences. It cared about your obedience. And if you couldn't offer that, you were expendable. Udi. And I haven't even told you what happens when you try to leave. You see, in feudal Japan, you couldn't just walk away from your village, from your role, from your life. If you were a peasant and dared leave your province without permission, that wasn't called traveling. It was called treason. You were, in every sense, a prisoner of rice, of land, of your name. I think back to when I was 18. I packed a backpack, left my hometown, no real plan, just a bus ticket, and the kind of confidence that only comes from not knowing better. I thought that was brave, but in feudal Japan, that would have been seen as betrayal. You couldn't choose reinvention, and you couldn't start over. You were born on a plot of land and expected to live and die there, as if your soul had been planted alongside the rice. And if you disappeared, if you ran, your entire family would be questioned. Dishonor doesn't just touch the guilty, it soaks everything. You'd vanish, and your parents would bow in apology for the rest of their lives. Your sister's marriage proposal would dissolve. Your brother would be denied a position. Your name would rot like old silk. So, no, they didn't run. They endured. And if, by some miracle, you were allowed to rise, to leave, to travel even then, the world outside your province wasn't freedom. It was judgment. Every other village saw you as a curiosity, a threat, a disruption to the order. You were a wrinkle in the map, and in feudal Japan, wrinkles were ironed out. And all the while, the code remained. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Not just a guidebook for samurai, a blueprint for existing in a world where your value was determined by how well you could suffer in silence. Imagine being trained from birth not to avoid death, but to greet it properly, to look it in the eye, to bow to it. I've sat in rooms with people who had lost everything: homes, families, futures, and the thing they often say is, "I didn't even see it coming." In feudal Japan, they always saw it coming. It wasn't an end. It was a possibility you folded into your kimono every morning before stepping outside. And this endless submission, it wasn't fueled by ignorance. They knew. They knew the system was cruel, but it was stable. It endured like a mountain, unmoving, unforgiving. Which brings me to something even darker. You see, in a world this rigid, even love becomes dangerous. And yet, it still happened. Secretly, painfully. I've read poems from the era, quiet verses about stolen glances, inked with trembling hands. Love in feudal Japan was an affliction, something you endured like frostbite. You didn't chase it, you buried it deep. For we, a samurai might fall in love with a servant, a peasant girl might dream of a merchant's son, but those dreams stayed dreams. Spoken out loud, they became shame, and shame was a poison that didn't just kill you, it infected your descendants. And still, people loved, because no system, no matter how brutal, can truly erase the human heart. But it could punish it, and often did. You think being caught cheating in feudal Japan meant divorce? No, it meant dismemberment, death, sometimes for both parties, sometimes even the child, because shame, once discovered, had to be cleansed. And then there were the stories that weren't told, the quiet ones, the women who bore sons that looked too much like someone else, the servants who disappeared in the night, the marriages that turned into cold, ceremonial routines, two people sleeping beside each other, never once making eye contact. That's what honor demanded. That's what survival required. Oh. And even outside of love, relationships were battles. Between fathers and sons, lords and retainers, peasants and headmen. Every interaction had a script. Every conversation had invisible walls. I remember watching a traditional Japanese play once, No Theater. The actors moved so slowly, so deliberately, I could barely follow the plot. But that was the point. It wasn't about what they were doing. It was about how. That's how feudal life was, not about joy or pain or even purpose. It was about presentation. You lived, died, and were remembered based on how well you performed. That's why death wasn't feared the way we fear it today. It was an exit, a chance to deliver your final lines with grace. And for the samurai, that grace could come at the tip of their own blade. Seppuku, ritual suicide. You've heard of it, but you don't really understand it until you see the details. You kneel, you unfasten your robe, you write a farewell. You draw the blade not long, but curved, like a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and then you cut dot across your stomach. Slowly, deeply, deliberately. And if you flinch, if you cry out, if your expression breaks, you failed. There's even a second there, your chosen Kaishakunin, the one who's supposed to end it with a swift strike to the neck. He's watching you, waiting to see if you die properly. Because even your death had an audience. I've thought about that a lot. About how most of us, in our last moments, want someone holding our hand, whispering comfort. But in feudal Japan, your last comfort was your own dignity. And no one could give it to you. You had to earn it. So no, you wouldn't last a day. Because the test isn't pain. It's perfection. Perfection in silence. Perfection in sorrow. Perfection in submission. And even if you passed, there was always tomorrow. Another sunrise, another bow, another chance to breathe too loudly and lose everything. And here's the part that still lives with me. Even if you passed every test, every bow, every glance, every word perfectly chosen, you could still fall. Not because of what you did, but because of something your cousin said, or a debt your father owed, or a servant who whispered the wrong rumor. Because in feudal Japan, identity wasn't individual, it was communal. Your honor wasn't yours. It was rented, shared. It belonged to your clan, your house, your bloodline. I think about that sometimes when I see people chasing their personal brand. We live in an era where we craft our own identity, like sculpture filtering our lives, curating our emotions. But in feudal Japan, your brand was inherited, like a scar. And any scratch on it, real or imagined, meant pain. It meant losing everything. Sometimes that meant exile. Other times, it meant a quiet knock at your door in the middle of the night. A message, a name, and a short blade, left behind like punctuation at the end of your story. But maybe you weren't a samurai. Maybe you were a peasant, just trying to survive. You think that meant less pressure? Think again. Your life was rice. Everything else, love, family, breath, came second. You lived by the seasons. You prayed for rain, or for it to stop. You bowed to every tax collector, even if your children hadn't eaten in 3 days. And if the harvest failed, no one came to help. There was no social safety net, just more demands, more obligation, more silence. Inahoji that, your feet cracked from fieldwork, your back curled before 30, and still you bowed, because that's what you were supposed to do. You thanked the gods. You whispered apologies to your ancestors for not being better. And if you tried to hide some rice, if you set aside just a small sack so your wife wouldn't waste away, that was treason, punishable by death, by public beheading. You don't just watch your neighbor executed. You watch his wife be ordered to clean the blood, and then the taxman turns to you and smiles. That's the life most people lived. Not the armored romance of the samurai. Not the silk-threaded whispers of the aristocracy. Just mud, cold, silence, and the endless weight of duty. But even then, there were moments. Small ones. Cherry blossoms falling at dawn. The first sip of miso soup on a winter morning. A child learning to write his name in the dirt. That's what they lived for. Not freedom. Not joy. Moments. And even those were earned. Let me tell you about a story I read once. A samurai disgraced not by failure in battle, but by laughter. He laughed at a joke made by a junior retainer in front of his lord. A harmless moment. But the laugh was too loud, too casual. He was summoned the next day, offered a quiet room, given time to compose a final poem. That's all it took. One moment of ease. One breath too deep. And his life unraveled. You think you could live like that? On the edge of the blade, every day? You think you could laugh only when it's safe? Bow only at the precise angle? Walk only when summoned? No. None of us could. We're too loud, too restless, too free. We'd speak without permission. We'd love without arrangement. We'd want to leave. And feudal Japan was not built for people who leave. Even architecture told you that. Temples were made of wood, paper walls, sliding doors, but everything was arranged according to strict geometry. Space meant status. You could walk into a room and know who mattered by where they sat, how high the platform was beneath their cushion. Even the threshold of a door was sacred. Step over it the wrong way? Dishonor. Sit before being invited? Disrespect. Touch a scroll without permission? Presumption. Every gesture was a performance, and every audience carried a sword. Now maybe you think, I'd just follow the rules, I'd keep my head down, I'd survive. But that's not survival, that's surrender. That's hollowing yourself out piece by piece until only the mask remains. I once met an elderly man, Japanese, from a line of craftsmen that traced back generations. He told me something I'll never forget. He said, "In my grandfather's time, you did not ask who you wanted to be. You asked, how can I be less of a burden to my family? Think about that. Your life wasn't about happiness. It was about reducing shame. And shame wasn't yours alone. It bled outward. It stained everyone. That's why people chose death. Because to live in disgrace meant taking everyone you loved with you. And so they knelt. With perfect posture. And they whispered the right words. And the blade did the rest. Tuodines. You see, in feudal Japan, even the things we call beautiful today were never just about beauty. The cherry blossoms? To us, they're romantic, symbolic, Instagram-worthy. But to them, they were a metaphor for impermanence. The samurai looked at those blossoms and saw themselves fragile, flawless, destined to fall. That's how deeply death was woven into life. Not something to fear, something to become. I remember once standing beneath a cherry tree at dusk, petals falling all around. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear the sound of them landing. And I thought, what if this moment wasn't just soft? What if it was a warning? A reminder, nothing lasts. Especially not you. Even something as gentle as a flower could hold the weight of mortality in this world. But that's how they lived, eyes wide open, back straight, ready. Even a meal wasn't just food. You didn't just eat. You performed the act of eating. The rice was portioned. The soup was placed at a precise angle. You thanked the gods before and after. You didn't speak while chewing. You didn't slouch. And you never ever asked for more unless it was offered. To show hunger was to show lack. And lack, that was weakness. That's the word that keeps coming back to me. Weakness. There was no room for it. Not in your posture, not in your thoughts, not in your breath. Everything had to be contained. You learned to hide it, the ache, the longing, the exhaustion. And that's how people survived. By hiding. I once watched an elderly woman prepare tea for a guest. It took over 20 minutes. Every motion was exact. The folding of the cloth, the placement of the cup, the angle of the pour. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But there was reverence in every move. Later, I asked her why the ceremony had to be so precise. She said, because if I do it with care, you will know you matter. If I rush, you will know I don't. McRest. That's what the culture demanded. That everything, even tea, carried the weight of respect. And that's beautiful until it becomes unbearable, because it never ends. There's no off switch. There's no private self. Not really. Even your thoughts had to be managed. If you doubted your Lord, you wrote a poem instead of an argument. If you disliked your marriage, you folded the sheets more neatly. If you wanted more from life, you didn't. That want itself was shameful. And then there's war. War in feudal Japan wasn't like anything you've imagined. It wasn't always screaming and blood. Sometimes it was quiet, formal, icy. Call 2 armies would meet. No yelling, no insults, just flags, signals. Then the arrows would begin. And the dying. And after the dying, the judging. Because how you died in war mattered more than why. I read once about a samurai who, knowing his side had lost, calmly walked into the river, armor still on, and allowed the current to take him. He didn't want to be captured, not because he feared pain, but because capture would stain his family. So he let the water claim him, without a word. That's what honor looked like. Not survival, sacrifice. Sometimes I wonder what would they think of us. Of our noise, our need for validation, our constant searching. Would they pity us or envy us because we have something they didn't? Choice. But choice is messy. Choice means confusion, failure, contradiction. They didn't have to choose. They just had to perform. And if they performed well, they were remembered for their silence, for their posture, for their final bow. I don't romanticize it, I admire it, but I don't envy it. Because to live in feudal Japan truly live meant giving up everything that made you you, and replacing it with something crafted, curated, approved. A mask so perfect it couldn't crack, even in death. And so, if you still think you'd last a day in feudal Japan, ask yourself, could you erase your dreams? Could you speak only when spoken to? Could you kneel in the mud while someone dressed in silk judged your worth? Could you hold still while your world collapsed and smile through the ceremony? Could you live without asking why? I couldn't. And I think maybe that's okay. Because some lives are meant to be endured, and others are meant to witness, to remember, to carry the stories forward. Not to glorify them, but to understand them. Because somewhere in that silence, in that stillness, in that unbearable elegance, is the reminder that human beings will survive anything, even the loss of themselves, if the world asks it hard enough. But not forever. And still, I think about them. The ones who never asked what if, because they weren't allowed to. They woke before the sun, bowed before they breathed, worked before they wept. They memorized silence. They drank shame like water, and they carried themselves through life like shadows, trained to move with grace. They didn't dream of more. They dreamt of not disgracing what they already had. Imagine that. Waking up, not with hope, but with fear. Fear of misstep, of misspeaking, of standing out when you were meant to blend in. Even the language reflected this. There were whole systems of speech honorifics, formality layers designed just to make sure you didn't overstep. You spoke differently to your father than your friend, to your friend than your lord. Even verbs changed depending on the level of humility expected. Imagine every sentence being a negotiation with survival. I once struggled through a conversation in formal Japanese with an elder. My tutor later told me I had bowed too soon, and that I'd accidentally used the word for modest gift when referring to something I was supposed to exalt. I had no idea, but in feudal Japan, that slip would have been devastating, unforgivable. Language wasn't just communication. It was obedience. Even laughter had to be measured. I've sat with people in Japan who covered their mouths when they laughed, not because they were embarrassed, but because there's a cultural echo of that older feudal discipline. Too much joy, too loudly shown, could still feel improper, even now. Oh, even here. That's how deep the performance ran. It didn't stop at death. It didn't stop at borders. It sank into the blood. And then there's the question of legacy. Because what did you leave behind? Not wealth, not freedom, but your name. Aww. Your family crest. Is a dinero, your reputation, fossilized into the minds of those still alive. And if you brought dishonor, that name would rot, that crest would dim, your grandchildren would bow lower in shame because of a mistake you made before they were born. Well, legacy wasn't glory, it was cleanliness. A clean record, a clean death, a clean bow. Nothing flamboyant, nothing revolutionary, just quiet correctness. That's the haunting part. That a whole civilization could be built on the power of restraint. Not expression, not expansion. The city. Just perfect restraint. And somehow it lasted. Through war, through disaster, through centuries. Because when you carve away the self, what's left is order. But what kind of life is that? One where even crying could be seen as selfish? One where your worth is measured not by your heart, but by how well you disappear inside a script. We think of strength as loud. They didn't. They believed in the power of silence. White Haruhi. A samurai's strongest moment wasn't the swing of the sword. It was the moment he chose not to draw it. Discipline wasn't about muscle, it was about invisibility. The less of yourself you showed, the more honorable you were. That's why even today we're drawn to the idea of it. The discipline. The precision. The stillness. Because deep down, we live in a world that feels too loud, too fast, too selfish. And there's something about feudal Japan, cruel as it was, that promises control. It promises stillness. It promises meaning. Every action meant something. Every bow had weight. Every silence was sacred. But the price was your soul. And that brings me here, to this moment. You've listened, maybe with curiosity, maybe with disbelief, Maybe with that quiet voice in the back of your mind whispering, maybe I could have made it. But I'll ask you one last time. Could you live your entire life without being seen for who you are? Could you raise children knowing their path was set before their first breath? Could you stand still in the face of injustice and say nothing, not because you agree, but because to speak is to die? Could you lose everything you love and thank your Lord for the opportunity to prove your humility? If you can answer yes to all of that, then maybe you would have lasted. But if there's even a part of you, a flicker that wants to choose, you wouldn't have survived. And you weren't meant to. Because feudal Japan wasn't designed for you. It was designed against you. And yet, it remains beautiful. Mysteriously beautiful. Because that's the contradiction. That something so devastating could be crafted with such care. That a society so merciless could build temples that whisper peace. That people so burdened could still write poetry. We walk through modern life thinking we've evolved past all this. But the truth is, the ghost of feudal Japan still lingers. In the way we measure ourselves. In the way we hide emotion to seem strong. In the way we obey without realizing we're obeying. It never fully left. It just changed shape. So maybe we didn't survive it after all. Maybe it survives in us. Now, if you've made it this far, if you've wandered this long path with me through mud, silk, and silence, then you know what I'm going to ask. Not out of obligation. Well, but because stories like this, they deserve to be shared. You know? So, if this resonated with you, and if you found something here, something quiet, or something haunting, then leave a like. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, ones that don't just inform, but unsettle. And maybe leave a comment. Tell me where you would have stood in feudal Japan. Tell me if you think you would have lasted. I'll be reading. Until next time, bow low. Speak softly. You see, and remember even silence has weight.